Hello friends! So this video will likely be a bit controversial, but I think it's important to do. I'm going to talk about how we can go from NPC to fully awakened. This is based on my soul sync framework of what a human being is, which is probably a little different than what you're used to hearing. And I don't see NPCs the way most people do, like these soulless automatons that are like robots roaming the earth. I see it different than that. I see every human being as basically being a receiver for consciousness, and we have a higher self that is trying to steer and integrate with the human being. But most people, like the vast majority of people, have snuffed out that connection. They've turned their dial. They're out of tune with their higher self, with the signal. So they are just being led by their physical body, and that's the ego. Okay, so if you look at things this way, this is how Soul Sync breaks it down. We're a merger of two things. We're a human self and a higher self. So you have your physical body, this physical avatar, and it has its own level of consciousness. Okay, the consciousness is a spectrum. So it has its own consciousness because it is purely about survival. Okay, the main things the human body wants to do is survive, and it wants to find tribe, and it wants to reproduce, and it wants to find shelter, and it wants to find work, and it wants to find food, and it wants to have some fun, that kind of stuff. That's what the human body wants to do. Well, the higher self isn't as concerned about those kinds of things because it's just using the human self as a vehicle to explore this physical world, and it comes in with a mission, a to-do list, and it wants to understand, and it wants to learn, it wants to grow and evolve at a spiritual consciousness level. Okay, so you have these two different things that are trying to inhabit this one space. Now the physical body is very powerful. That's the ego. The ego is very powerful, and that's why when you go through this spiritual enlightenment period, there's usually a few things that happen. First, there's like the call to, kind of the calling. You get this urge. Somebody's like, oh, there's more out there. I want to know more. And then usually there's something happens that creates this catalyst for this awakening. It cracks open the shell and it starts letting in the light. Well, the light in this case is literally your higher self. It's you, it's your consciousness coming in. And then there's usually kind of a dark night of the soul period, and that's literally your physical body, who at this point is in charge, fully in charge, maybe 90% in charge because you cracked open that shell a little bit. And it starts to have a dark night of the soul because all the things that it believed and thought it knew and everything, all its belief systems start crumbling down. It starts to realize that, oh my God, I've been lied to and I've been deceived and nothing's real. And it has a dark night of the soul period. And then you have this like initiation process, right? Well, that initiation process is your higher self, your soul, your spirit, your consciousness cracking open that egg and coming in even more, right? And when that happens, it's amazing. It's like someone's running through a dark house flipping on all the light switches, and it's really good. But your ego, your physical body, right? Remember, you're a human self and you're a higher self sharing space. You're basically a human self that is a receiver for the signal of your consciousness that kind of streams in, kind of like how Netflix streams into a TV. Your consciousness streams into your physical body to have this human earth life experience. So the physical body kind of doesn't really want the consciousness fully integrated because it sees the consciousness as that annoying patchouli wearing kumbaya hippie, right? Like, you're all love and light and you're all trying to figure out the mysteries of the universe and everything, where the human self just wants to survive. Okay, that's all it cares about, is survival. That's its prime directive, period. And it sees the higher self sort of as a nuisance, sometimes as an invader. And if you're not on the same page, it can cause all sorts of problems: anxiety, depression, psychosis, all that kind of stuff. That's why when people have these like Kundalini experiences, sometimes it goes very, very bad. Sometimes it goes very, very good. It all depends on how it's received by the physical body, how the human self receives the higher self, and if they can get along. And that's why it's good to do it gradually. But a lot of times it happens spontaneously. And then there's this integration period where the higher self is now kind of taken over, and it's in its role that it's supposed to be. It's like a coach, and the body's the team, and the coach is supposed to be guiding and motivating and inspiring and bringing everyone together. That's the role of the higher self. But the higher self can't do that unless it's in charge. And the problem with most people, myself included up until a few years ago, was that my human self was always in charge, and my higher self was just like a jack in the box. It was down at the bottom. It wanted to bust out, but it just couldn't. And then when it finally did, in my case, with my near-death experience, it just busted out like a freaking jack in the box. And I wouldn't recommend that, but sometimes that's the only way. And I think that the higher self orchestrates some of these things because the higher self is like, hey, the clock is ticking. We only have a certain amount of time in this physical body, and we have some jobs to get done. We came here on a mission, and it needs to penetrate. It needs to get in there. And it can only do that if it cracks open that egg, you know, and that's the whole initiation process. That's the spiritual awakening. So when people talk about having a spiritual awakening, that's what it is. It's the fact that for the longest time you were completely driven and overpowered by your human self. And the human self, in my view, is the ego. Okay? That's why when people talk about having a spiritual enlightenment, they talk about the ego death, the death of the ego. Well, your ego doesn't die. It's just it loses control. And it has to go through that dark night of the soul period where it loses control, all its belief systems crumble down, and it has to take a back seat to the higher self, to your consciousness. And it doesn't always like to do that. And that's why it's important to talk through this, to work through this, to do a lot of like grounding, inner shadow work, you know, really surround yourself with good, positive people, treat your body good, clean water, good foods, you know, exercise, get a lot of sun, all that kind of stuff, just to really nurture everything and make sure that the environment for this, you know, unification to happen is as positive and healthy as possible. So that's how I see the whole enlightenment process and the kind of delicate dance between, you know, this duality of the human self and the higher self. And, you know, like I said before, the NPC concept is just when you have closed off your higher self completely. And then when you see people that are just fully freaking awake and enlightened, that's just because they have basically, you know, recalibrated their body to where their higher self is now, you know, it's like I said before, it's our body is like a tuner is tuning in the signal from our consciousness, and you're streaming in. Well, it's kind of like a radio station, you know, look at it that way. When your dial's on the right station and it's crystal clear, you got a great signal. When it's off a little bit, it's all fuzzy and staticky and stuff. When it's totally off, you have no signal at all. So most people just have no signal. And then when you actually get it on the station and you have a clear signal, boom, that's the spiritual awakening. That's the enlightenment. That's when people are fully awake. So that's how I think you go from NPC to fully awakened. That's my take on it. That's how I see it through the lens of SoulSync. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Let me know below. Have a beautiful day. Peace.